What is up guys, Blue Spooky here. Just wanted to let you guys know before you start this video that this is going to be a best of compilation from the months of June and July. I'm not really feeling well tonight, having a bit of a headache, and I'm a little bit fuzzy-headed as well, so it's been a little bit hard to read the stories and record. I hope you guys will still enjoy the video, and I will have a regular video for you guys tomorrow as usual. I will only have ads after the first 2 stories in this video, and after that it will be ad-free, so feel free to watch it as you fall asleep or what have you, maybe in the background or something. Without further ado, I will let you guys get right on with it. Thank you so much for watching. I only ever picked up a hitchhiker once in my entire life, but that one time was so absolutely bad, I would never consider doing it again. Hell, if I saw a one-legged war veteran walking naked in the snow trying to hitchhike, I still would not pick them up. That's how frightening this experience was for me. I was making a cross-country drive back in the 1990s. My family lived in the East, and I was living in California. I didn't really care for flying myself, so whenever I went home, I simply enjoyed a nice trip from California to Pennsylvania in my car. It was a good 4 to 5 day trip. On the second night, while I was driving through the desert at night, I noticed there was a man on the side of the road up in the distance. He was holding a cardboard sign and sitting off on the shoulder. I did think it was a bit odd to see that out in the desert, but I also immediately had some sympathy for the guy. Because of that, I stopped to pick him up. He seemed quite elated at first. He made a lot of small talk, and I asked him where I should be taking him. He said he wasn't going anywhere in particular, and if I could just take him to the next city, I could drop him off there and that would be just fine. After a short while, though, after things were settling down a bit, it was then that it began to get weird. He started saying things that really creeped me out. It began when he just said right out of the blue, "You know, you shouldn't pick up hitchhikers." I was surprised, but I asked him why he would say such a thing. After all, he was a hitchhiker who needed a ride. "Yeah, but you don't know anything about me," he responded. "You can run into some pretty crazy people out here." He paused for a moment, then laughed. I mean, personally, I'd never pick up a hitchhiker myself. I tried countering him by saying that he had no idea what kind of person the guy picking him up was either. He actually agreed with that, though. I tried to change the subject several times. I tried to ask him about why he was out here hitchhiking to begin with, but he didn't seem to really want to talk about it. After a while, he went back to talking about the dangers of hitchhiking. It was then that he said he had a question for me. He asked me, "So what would you do if I had a box cutter in my jacket, and I just sorta pulled it out on you, you know?" And the question freaked me out, of course, but I didn't really want to let that show. I simply responded that I'd probably do whatever he wanted me to. I didn't want to get hurt that night. The hitchhiker laughed a little. Then he changed the subject himself. He talked about other things. When we got to the next city, he told me I could drop him off at a hotel, and he could find himself a room quite easily. I agreed, ready to get him out as soon as possible. At that point, I was a bit upset. After the initial freakiness, I was so weirded out. We actually had a good conversation for the rest of the ride, though. I pulled up to the office of the hotel, told him goodbye, and he got out of the car before closing the door on his own. Before he did, though, he paused for a moment and reached into his pocket. He took out a box cutter and showed it to me, and then grinned the freakiest grin I'd ever seen. "You're pretty lucky tonight, man," he told me. "I only like people who fight back." He closed the door. I sped out of there as quickly as possible, and I've never picked up a hitchhiker since. We've all heard the old adage that you should never pick up a hitchhiker. I remember even seeing a movie about it from the 1980s, called The Hitchhiker. It scared the crap out of me, and I swore I would never pick one up. I never have, but I did hitchhike on my own once. I was in college at the time. I'd like to say that this was a time when I was studying at the library or something like that, but of course I was not. I was at an off-campus party with some friends. It wasn't even off-campus really either. It was one town over. My friend Mike had given me a ride to the party. I was definitely drinking quite a lot that night and having a ball. Before I knew it, it was already 3 o'clock in the morning. Well, when I went looking for Mike, it turned out the damn bastard had met a girl 2 hours before and left on his own. I tried calling and texting him multiple times, but of course he was not answering. I tried to find someone else to drive me home as well, but either everyone was too drunk or they didn't want to leave the party yet. I had to get back to the dorms though really soon, because I had a lot of homework to do the next morning or the next afternoon, or it would all be late. Not knowing what else to do and not having enough money on me for a cab, I figured I'd just have to hoof it. If I got lucky, maybe Mike would get in touch with me while I was walking and come to pick me up on the way there. If not, it's not like I hadn't walked long distances in the past before. So, I set out. I was out for maybe 15 minutes or so when I saw the first strike of lightning in the sky. I groaned and tried to walk faster. I kept on hoping I could make it home before the rain fully started. I did not. About 10 minutes after I saw the first bolt of lightning, it began to lightly rain. It was then that a car came down the road. They pulled slightly ahead of me and onto the curb. When I walked by it, the guy inside offered me a ride. I wasn't sure at first. As I mentioned, I always thought hitchhiking was dangerous for either person involved. As I was mulling it over though, a loud crack of thunder changed my mind immediately. I hopped into the car, but soon after I wished I had not. The guy driving the car was extremely creepy. He kept giving me this weird-ass look, and didn't say much of anything either. I tried thanking him for giving me the ride, but he just continuously brushed me off and refused to respond to me. It almost seemed like he was uncomfortable with me even existing next to him. That made me begin to wonder why he'd even pick me up to begin with. When we were getting closer to the college campus, he asked me if I could grab something out of his glove compartment for him. I said sure. When I opened it though, I froze as I saw a large knife sitting right there. I asked him what exactly he needed from inside. He actually said to me, and I kid you not, "Could you hand me that knife, please? I'm gonna need it soon." I couldn't think of a single reason, or at least a single non-scary reason, that the man would need this knife while driving his car. I asked him what he would need such a thing for. At that very moment, he got extremely angry with me and began to yell and scream at me. "Just give me the damn knife." When I hesitated, he leaned over me and reached for it himself while still driving. I was closer to the knife though, and now I was scared. I grabbed the knife myself and pointed it at the man. He reclined to his side of the car, and I demanded he stop right now and let me out. I could see in his eyes that he was furious. He did pull over though. As I was getting out, he again told me to give him back his knife. I basically told him to fuck off and get lost. I'd leave it on the side of the road for him later, and he could circle back and get it if he really wanted it. Of course he cursed me out. He did leave a while after. I did not leave the knife there. In fact, I threw it in the garbage when I got home. Last thing I needed was for him to come back for it and then chase me down with it. I walked the rest of the way back home in the rain, and it was a very miserable experience. A few winters back, I had a pretty horrible experience with a hitchhiker. I was out really late at night having attended a holiday party for work. While I was talking with a few people there, I noticed something that caught my eye out the window. It had started snowing while we were there. I hadn't exactly expected that to happen. I drive a Mustang which has rear-wheel drive and doesn't necessarily handle very well in the snowy weather. I had to excuse myself from the party and drive on home early. Once I got on the road, the snow began falling heavily. The visibility was extremely bad. I had to drive very slowly to keep myself from skidding around as I was driving. A little bit further up the road, though, I noticed a figure in the light of a street lamp. It seemed to be a hitchhiker of some sort. My first impulse was to just drive right past him. The only thing I wanted in that moment was to get home ASAP. As I approached closer though, I suddenly remembered when I was younger, and I used to go hitchhiking all the time. There were plenty of kind people in those days who picked me up and helped me out as well. Feeling a bit of sympathy, I pulled over and offered the man a ride. He was about the same size as me. I'm also a guy if you hadn't figured that out yet. The man seemed vastly underdressed for being out in this kind of snowy weather. He only had on a pair of regular jeans and a jean jacket, no gloves or anything like that. As I pulled my car back onto the road, I asked the man where he was off to. At first, he didn't answer me. He just sort of looked at me extremely strangely when I asked him. Then, when I asked him where I could take him, he responded very strangely. "Well, where are you going?" I wasn't exactly sure how to answer that. I was already regretting picking him up, and I simply told him I was on my way home. He replied, "Oh, where's home then?" I wasn't about to tell this complete stranger where I lived, especially not one who was acting as weird as he was. I lied to him and told him I lived somewhere else entirely than where I actually lived. I asked him again where he needed me to take him, and what he said next gives me goosebumps even today. "Oh yeah? Well, that's where I'm going too." He smiled at me. "What a coincidence, huh?" I was obviously startled at this point. I decided I would just drive him to where I thought I could safely let him out of the car, then drive off on my own. I drove him to the apartment complex I'd lied about living in. When I pulled in, I asked him which building he wanted me to drop him off at. He told me there was no need. "Just park where you normally park. I'll walk back to my place from there." I didn't know what this guy was up to, but I couldn't imagine it was going to be anything good. I figured I had to at least pretend to go along with it though, just to get him out of my car. I pulled into a parking spot and indicated the building I claimed to live in. I did have a plan to get away from the man, but the timing would have to be perfect in order for it to work. I opened the door and took a single step out of the car. He did too. I pretended like I was going to shut my door, but I didn't quite yet. When he shut his door behind him, I quickly hit the lock button, then jumped into my car and pulled the door closed. He turned around right away, clearly furious. It seemed my reservations about the man had been accurate. When he saw I'd locked him out, he started screaming and yelling at me. As I pulled out of the parking spot, he grabbed onto the passenger side view mirror and started pounding on my car as I pulled away from him. I made no attempt to try not to hit him, as I saw him take a knife out of his pocket and begin stabbing at my windows. He then ran it along the side of my car, scraping the hell out of it as I slowly drove away. Luckily, I got away with nothing but a very nasty and long cut on my paint job. It cost quite a bit to fix, but at least I got away without a cut on me. Before my mom married my dad, she dated a man named Craig. At first, he was sweet, but he slowly became abusive over time. My mom tried to leave multiple times, but Craig always threatened her. After one particularly violent argument, my mom waited and fled in the middle of the night. The years passed by, and she got married and had me. My dad's work included a lot of traveling, so it was mostly my mom and I at home alone in our big acreage home. I remember my mom was in the kitchen baking lasagna while I was sitting in my high chair. It was extremely hot that day, so she opened the kitchen door to let in some air. All of a sudden, she heard heavy footsteps enter the kitchen behind her. My excited mom assumed it was my dad returning and whipped around with a, "Hello, my love." Her excitement immediately turned to horror though. There was Craig, standing in the middle of our kitchen with a gun visibly tucked into his pants. Craig smiled at her and asked her what she was making. My mom mustered enough courage and told him she was making lasagna. She was physically shaking as Craig sat himself down beside me. He playfully pinched my cheek, and I remember laughing at him. My mom was holding back tears as she asked him what he was doing inside our house. Craig said he only wanted to visit my mom, and he would leave after we were done eating. When the lasagna was ready, she served it to him. My mom took me and sat across from Craig, so she could keep a better eye on him. He said he still had her things at his house, and she was welcome to come by and get them soon. She told him she no longer needed any of it, and he could simply throw it out. He started to get very agitated and said she'd thrown him away like garbage too. Craig said she was acting tough, but he knew deep down she was still the stupid little girl he had dated. He claimed my mom needed him in her life, and that she couldn't function if he wasn't there to help her. He said he needed to be there to raise me because my dad was a slur who could never be able to protect my mom or I. He said if he really was crazy, he could have easily kidnapped us or done things to my mom right now because my dad was just a pussy who couldn't protect what was his. My mom started to cry and told Craig to leave right now. He said it wasn't her house anymore, and he had every right to be there. My mom said if he didn't leave, she would call the police, which obviously made him angry. He threatened that if the cops got involved, he would hire people to cut her into pieces and film it as well. My mom started to cry even more. Craig then threw his plate and screamed at her to stop crying right now. I got scared and started to cry too, which caused Craig to stand up and approach my mom. She jumped out of her chair and cradled me in her arms. She begged for Craig to at least spare my life. He tried to reach over to touch my mom, but she got so scared she fell to the floor sobbing. At that exact moment, the phone began to ring. I guess Craig had become so overwhelmed or something that he just sprinted out of the house. The cops and his family found him about to shoot himself in the head after my mom called the police. His adult son had to convince him not to do it. My mom was so traumatized, she didn't want to deal with any of it. She simply got a restraining order against him. She and my dad moved across the country after. I got a bit curious recently and searched this guy up to see what he was doing. I was shocked to see he was dating a college-age girl who looked just like the woman he could never have. So this happened to me a couple of years ago, when my now husband and I were living in a townhouse in a pretty decent area. My husband was working third shift as a corrections officer at our local corrections facility, and I was working as a waitress/bartender. It was an unusually warm night for mid-March, so I took advantage and decided to take my husband's 80-pound Alaskan Malamute/Siberian Husky mixed dog on a quick walk around the neighborhood near our complex. We get to the end of the street that leads into the complex we live in. I noticed as the dog, Luke, stopped to relieve himself that there was a man across the street at the gas station with a case of beer in his hands. I had my phone out texting a friend and looked back up to notice the man was near the stop sign and seemed to be relieving himself upon it. I felt really awkward seeing this and instantly put my phone away. I hurriedly led Luke down the street on our path. At this point, I thought the guy must have noticed us. He crossed the street to where Luke and I had just been. Now I could hear him walking a few feet behind me. I just kept my head down. I pulled my phone back out and stared at it, with Luke glued to my hip. About 10 seconds later, though, I could hear the guy's steps getting faster. Luke realized the man was now behind us and stopped in his tracks. Mind you, he is a big dog compared to my 5'2" self. I can handle him easily enough, and he's very well trained by my husband. But I noticed his ears were perked up, and his tail was straight as well. I was glad he was aware of our surroundings. I wanted to keep moving, but I got this weird feeling. This guy finally caught up to us, so I tightened my grip on Luke's leash and pulled him closer to me. I stepped off into the grass to allow the man to pass us by and keep Luke out of his way. Did this guy keep going and pass, though? No, of course not. When I thought he was about to go by us, I stuttered out a small apology because Luke was pulling on his leash to investigate the man. Most people were intimidated by him simply by his size. The man stopped and looked me up and down for a moment, long enough for me to smell the booze and cigarettes rolling off of him, and to notice he seemed to be in his mid to late 20s, dark hair, scruffy looking, and extremely dirty. He smiled and seemed to notice Luke trying to get at him. "Cute dog, what's his name?" He proceeded to ask me if he could pet the dog. Before I could even give him an answer, he leaned down and grabbed Luke's face. Luke surely didn't like that. He jumped at him as a warning, and the man backed up chuckling. I apologized and mentioned he was very protective, and made up a lie he had been trained as my dad's former K-9 unit. Instantly, I saw the guy's face change. I don't know how to call it exactly. He asked me what my name was, and I gave him a fake name. He then asked if I lived around here, and I said I was visiting a friend of mine for the weekend. As soon as I finished saying this, he suddenly lunged toward me. I'm not lying when I say I've never heard my husband's dog growl in the 5 years I'd been with him. But the sound that came from my dog in that moment sounded like something from nightmares. Luke's hair was standing on end, and he was throwing himself on his back legs, kicking his front legs at the man. He was snapping at him as well. The man stumbled backward, nearly dropping his beer. "Alright, well, have a nice night then, cutie." He stumbled off down the road. When I say my heart was pounding, it was deafening. I grabbed Luke's leash so hard and sprinted between the buildings until I got back to my townhouse. I locked all the doors and collapsed by the front door. Luke was in my face the whole time, kissing me and whining. He is the sweetest and most gentle creature I've ever met, and seeing him growl and react the way he did made me realize I needed to get out of that situation and fast. I can't say I necessarily enjoyed going out and exploring the countryside, but it is something that I did a whole lot when I was younger. I think mostly because living out in the country, there wasn't exactly a whole lot else to do. My family never had cable back then, because this happened so long ago and it wasn't available in such a rural area. Other than that, we also lived far enough away from any of my friends or relatives that we couldn't spend time with them often and do things together. So, a lot of my free time, especially in the summer, was spent exploring the countryside on my lonesome. I didn't know a lot about the history of the area that we lived in, and this was before it was easy to just look these things up on the internet. Because of this, I never knew if I would find anything interesting or noteworthy out there. I always thought it would be cool to come across an Indian arrowhead or something like that. Like pretty much every kid in the world who goes out exploring in the country, I always hoped I would find something valuable out there one day. I mean, who knew if there was a gold piece stuck out there somewhere or something? Anyway, this one day in this one summer, I was really bored and went off exploring as usual. This time though, I tried heading off in a direction I hadn't really ever gone in before. I had avoided it mostly because my dad told me to. It was private property, I guess, and the man who owned it got very angry if he caught anyone out there. Plus, he claimed there were abandoned mines out there, and if I accidentally fell into one of those, it might be the last time anyone ever saw me alive. I went off in that direction, only slightly worried that one of these fates might befall me. I guess the slight fear made the hike a little bit more interesting. Other than that though, it was kind of fun thinking about the possibility of getting caught too. I don't know how long I had been out there, nor how many hills I had crossed over already. Eventually though, being on one side of a particular hill, I looked over at the one opposite facing it. I saw that inlaid about 3/4 of the way up the hill was what looked like either a cave or some sort of mine driven into the side. I assumed because of where it was most likely just a cave. It didn't look like it would be that easy to climb to, but it seemed very interesting to me, so I decided to go check it out. Getting to the opening was not easy. The hill was a whole lot steeper than the other ones I had experience with. After quite a bit of effort, including grasping onto trees that had thorns and caused my hands to bleed a little, I was finally able to make it up that steep hill and to the opening of this cave. I was actually a little bit apprehensive right away. This was the first such cave I had ever come across, despite all of the time I'd spent out there exploring. It was, as you might imagine, very, very dark, and I had only brought a small flashlight with me. I hadn't expected to come across a cave or be out after dark, so it was only one of those pen flashlights I always had with me in my backpack. It was a little damp inside, but that didn't really bother me so much. It was easy enough to avoid stepping into the water. Mostly, I was worried about the possibility of disturbing any bats that were in there. We didn't have as good an understanding about them back then as we do nowadays, so we thought that all bats bit, and they all carried rabies as well. It was bright enough at the opening. As I made my way into the cave though, I took out my pen light just in case I would need it. Of course, the very first thing I did was look at the ceiling to see if there were any bats inside. Fortunately, at least in concern of my feelings, I was happy not to see any in there. I probably would have screamed and started running had I seen even one of them. As I kept walking further into the cave, the light I got from the outside was now nearly gone. Soon, it was gone altogether. I suppose I should have headed back when it got to that point, but I was way too captured by curiosity with all of this. Although the entrance seemed to be a normal natural cave, further in it had wooden beams inside that looked like they had been made to reinforce the structure. Perhaps people had mined in this cave before. I mean, I didn't know enough about the differences between caves and mines to really know. The weirdest part though at this point were the echoes. My footfalls would sound like the footfalls of other people. A couple of times I even jumped, thinking that I heard someone following behind me. I was able to calm myself down after each try though, when suddenly I noticed something up ahead. It looked like something was lying on the ground up against the wall of the cave. It was too hard to make out in the dark at first, being that I only had this small light on me. However, as I got closer, I noticed something that stuck with me to this very day. There were bones in that cave. Although it was not a complete skeleton, I was able to tell there was a human skull there. It was the first time I'd ever seen anything like that before, and it truly scared me. I knew though that these bones had been there for a very long time, and whatever had killed this person couldn't possibly still be there to be a danger to me. But then I heard it. It sounded like someone whispering further down the cave. I wasn't sure I'd heard correctly at first, but when I froze and did my best to listen, I began to make it out clearer. There was absolutely someone whispering deeper in the darkness of that cave, echoing all the way up to me. I couldn't make out what was being said, but it was definitely a human voice. That was even scarier to me than finding that skull there. I got up and tried my best to hurry up out of the cave. I heard the whispering following behind me as I made my way back to the entrance. While I wasn't scared before going into the cave with the meager light, I was scared to death coming back out of it. I didn't want to run and make too much noise. If that person deeper in the cave was following me, I didn't want them to know exactly where I was. After I made it out, I ran down that hill fast as I could. I was very lucky not to fall down that steep slope and hurt myself. I don't know who could have been making those whispering sounds, but I never went back to find out. I had this really weird thing happen a few decades ago during the summer. Around that time, we lived in this beautiful house out in the country. My older brother and my stepmom's younger brother, who was about my age, would take turns hanging out at each other's houses. I personally didn't like hanging at her brother's house much because it was in Wheeling, West Virginia, and I wasn't really a big fan of that town. On the weekends, though, he would come over to our place, and we almost always went on a hike in the surrounding area. There was a ton of countryside we loved to explore. My brother and Pete, my stepmother's brother, were always out doing things together. And I mean really, really stupid things. Here are just a couple of examples. Once my brother wondered what it would feel like to piss on an electric fence, so he went and did it. Also, once at the top of the hill, there was a circular roll of hay. They decided to unravel it and roll it down the hill. Well, after they did that, every single cow that was grazing went running for that hay. We once came across a huge bulldozer sitting at the top of a hill too. They wanted to climb in the cab and mess with the gears, but fortunately I was able to talk them out of that one. One of the dumbest things I can recall them doing was taking a rock and throwing it at a bull's balls. Fortunately, when I found out they were trying to do something so moronic, I made my way up a tree before it happened. Even more fortunately for them, they were able to get up as well before being gored to death. So every time we went out on our little hikes together, I kept expecting these two guys to do something exceptionally stupid. Honestly though, the most memorable hike we ever didn't involve those two doing something stupid at all though. We'd had some frozen pizzas and watched some videos the night before, so we were really looking for something different to do on this day. We went out together. Now mind you, we lived really way out in the country. I mean, it took nearly an hour and a half to drive to the nearest town from where we were. The houses were obviously very far apart from each other as well. In fact, on the hill that we lived on, we were the first house up there. If you went further down the roads, it was nearly a 30-minute drive to the next house. We didn't know anybody in the area because of this. Plus, every single time we went out for an adventure, we never came across other people. We never came across any other hikers, we never stumbled across other houses. There were plenty of electric and barbed wire fences and animals, but no people to speak of whatsoever. On this particular day, we ended up spending a lot of time outside. I'd brought along a thermos of the worst flavored Kool-Aid, lemon lime. Whenever I tell this story, I can still taste that crap in my mind. We had been out for a really long time, walking across a few streams, climbing up and down hills. What was strange about this day, though, was that we were out a lot longer than we usually would be. Even when we ran out of stuff to drink, we just started drinking water from streams and creeks. As I was bending down to get a sip of water from a creek next to me, Pete came running up behind my brother and I. "Hey guys, you gotta see this, you won't believe this!" He was speaking in very whispered, excited tones. "Just don't make too much noise, okay? This is the freakiest thing I've ever seen." My brother and I followed close behind. He kept insisting we try not to make too much noise as we were walking. It was difficult because the ground was littered with dried and decaying leaves. He led us and crouched over to an area overlooking a creek, and that's when I saw the weirdest thing I'd ever seen in my life. Of course, keep in mind I was only 13 at that time. There was a huge man walking by the creek. I mean, he must have been the biggest man I'd ever seen. He was completely naked and covered in matted hair, which practically made up for not having clothes on. Even scarier, he was dragging a corpse behind him slowly. We couldn't tell if it was human or anything. It was skinned and he was dragging it along, which seemed quite weird to us. We all watched as he slowly walked back up the creek. I was trying not to make any noise because I was scared of this terrifying naked behemoth. I didn't want him to turn around and find us. If he did, I had no idea how he would react. That's why I was so tense. Remember how I told you earlier that Pete and my brother liked to do really stupid things when we went out? I just had every feeling they were going to do something to provoke this man's attention. I just remained as still as possible, ready to run faster than both of them if they did something dumb. Surprisingly enough to me, they were too scared to do so. The man kept dragging his corpse and eventually stumbled out of view. The whole thing was so bizarre, but what really got to me was this. Pete and my brother were willing to smack a bull in the balls with a rock, but they weren't willing to do anything to get this man's attention. That means they were more scared of what we saw that day than they were of a raging animal. Just let that sink in. Just to preface, I'm not going to include any actual details about myself, as I'm in pure fear that somehow this person will track this back to me. I, 24 and male, live in a quiet neighborhood in a suburban town in Queensland, Australia, with my roommate who's a 25-year-old woman. We're childhood friends and are both finishing our studies at university. These occurrences I'm about to tell you about started around 2 months ago, with the most recent update occurring only last weekend. About 2 months ago, I can't recall the exact date, I was lying in bed late at night, watching a soccer game and drifting in and out of sleep. I usually just use this as background noise to help me get to sleep easier, as I would say I'm a very nocturnal person by nature. I was just on the edge of being awake and asleep at once when I heard an urgent pounding at my front door. With the way the house was shaped, my bedroom was approximately 10 meters away from the front door and backed onto the front courtyard. The knock startled me at first. I was unsure if it was just in my head in a dream or actually happening. I laid still in silence to see if I would hear anything further. I knew it couldn't be my roommate, as she was out of town for the week visiting family and attending a wedding. After a bit of waiting, there was a second knock, just as hard. No one called out or said anything though. I'd like to say I'm not easily scared and enjoy watching horror movies in my free time, but suddenly I found myself frozen in place, not able to move at all. No further knocks came after, but I was too frightened now to fall back asleep and didn't end up resting until around 4 a.m. or so. I called my roommate the next morning, asking if she knew anyone that would have come to our door that late in the night. But she was just as confused as I was. A week passed by and I didn't really give it too much thought anymore. I sort of came to the conclusion that maybe it was some drunk person that had mistaken our house for theirs. It was a Saturday night when this happened. I work in a large chain grocery store doing night stacking a few days a week, with my shifts ending between 2 to 4 a.m. usually. It was the next Saturday, and I was approaching the end of my shift when my roommate texted me, saying someone was knocking on the front door again. Even though I wasn't actually there, I was struck with that same kind of fear I had experienced just the week prior. She reassured me the doors were all locked, but was scared knowing the same thing had happened to me as well. She kept in touch with me until my shift was over, and told me that this time there was no second knock. When I arrived home, the front yard was untouched, and there was no one out walking the street either. I must reinstate that this is a very quiet neighborhood, with mostly elderly couples living on our street. In the morning, my roommate still seemed a bit shaken up, so I put in an anonymous tip with a Crime Stopper service. They never got back to me though. Nothing else seemed to happen for the following month and a half. We were both moving on with our lives like it never even happened. I stopped working Saturday night shifts though, as this was the only similarity between the two occurrences. That was until the most recent Saturday. I was up late in the living room, watching some old Black Mirror episodes as the new season was about to come out. It was about 1 a.m. or so, and I had plans to go to bed after that episode I was watching. For context, the room I was in was right next to the front door this time, with the path to the door going past a large window. As I was watching, I saw the outside motion sensor light turn on from the bottom of the windowsill, under the blinds. I froze up. Until this point, I had completely forgotten about that knocking, and I was struck with fear. A short moment later, an urgent knocking began. At first, I was going to sit there and wait for them to go away, but after a second loud knock, I decided to look through the peephole quietly and see if it was someone familiar. My roommate had had a few failed relationships that did not end on good terms, so I assumed maybe it was one of them trying to mess with her. But as I looked closer, it was not. It was a woman I had never seen before. She was just staring at the door, stood still like a statue. It was like she was frozen solid. Her eyes were staring straight ahead with no expression. It was like she could see me through the eye hole, just staring into my soul. She stood there for another 2 minutes or so until she looked to the side and ran off into the darkness. I called the cops and explained on the phone what had happened, and they sent someone shortly thereafter. They checked all the cars parked on the street, but came up empty-handed. They just told me to call back if anything happened again. The thing that I couldn't get out of my head, though, was the way she just stood there emotionless, staring straight ahead as if she wasn't thinking at all, and the strange way she ran off as well. She looked to be in her 30s or so, wearing a small nightdress and no shoes. Not exactly someone I'd ever seen in the neighborhood before. Not only was this out of the ordinary, but it was completely freezing outside as well. Since then, I've ordered one of those doorbell cameras, just in case she does come back. To be completely honest with you though, I flinch whenever someone knocks on that door now. This happened when I was in my teens. I can't remember exactly when, but I think I was around 17 or so at this point. It was the school holidays, and I was at home with my friend who we'll call Talia, and my domestic worker who we'll call Lasego. It was around 11 a.m. or so, and we were just hanging out in my room together. Lasego had been washing dishes when she glanced out of the window. In another window, she saw the reflections of two men in our backyard. She ran upstairs to tell me what she had seen, and I immediately hit the panic button. The alarm started sounding loudly throughout the house. I remember calling my dad to tell him what was happening, but he was working quite far away and would take some time to get there. I believe he called the police at that point. I wanted to run downstairs and lock the security gate at the bottom, but at that point, over the loud wailing of the alarm system, I could distinctly hear the crack of wood splintering as they broke in the back door of the house. I was worried they would be faster than me and decided not to go downstairs to lock the gate. Instead, we raced across the upstairs landing to lock ourselves in my parents' bedroom. We reached the bedroom door and fuck, there was no key. We ran back across the landing again. Just as we were passing the top of the stairs, we saw those two men bounding up them just a meter away. They were both extremely large, clutching in their hands a screwdriver and a rope. Not a good sign. Lasego tried to grab our cell phones from the guest room as we passed. One of the men slapped her across the face, grabbed the phones, and pushed her into the room. Talia and I kept running, with the two men just a couple of meters behind us. We reached the end of the landing, dashed into my mom's office, and slammed the door hard behind me. My heart sank as I heard the clink of the key hitting the opposite wall. It had been on the other side of the door. At this point, Talia was hysterical, crying in the corner with both hands on her head as I held the door shut. What are we gonna do? I felt strangely calm though. I just remember thinking I could not let anything happen to either of my friends. There was a knock on the door behind me. Hello? I was in utter disbelief as these two intruders calmly knocked on the office door as if what was happening was the most normal thing in the entire world. We didn't respond. They knocked again. Hello? Once again, we didn't respond. The two men started turning the doorknob and pushing the door open against my back. I tried to stop the knob from turning, but I couldn't get a good grip on it. I pushed back against them, digging my heels into the carpet as deep as possible. Just then, the phone started to ring. I knew it must be someone calling to help us. I shouted to Talia to answer the phone and tell them what was happening, and to speak loudly as well. I wanted the intruders to know someone was on their way. While she was on the phone with the security company, I was fighting with these two men with all my strength for control over this single door. They pushed it open wide enough for a small adult to slip through, and I shoved back with all my might to get it just about shut again. This struggle went on for what felt like forever, but in reality was probably only a few minutes. The whole time the alarm was blaring loudly. Eventually the men gave up, and after waiting it out for a while, we felt safe enough to leave the room. My dad got there first, and we told them everything that happened. An armed response team arrived 40 minutes after we spoke to them on the phone. Yeah, geez, we'd already be dead or worse at that point. The police arrived 2 hours after them. Yeah, no one relies on the cops in South Africa. It was only when we were explaining the whole thing to the cops that the reality really started to set in and the adrenaline started to wear off. I went into shock and was all shaky for a bit. I felt grateful that everyone was okay in the end. I'm still amazed by what adrenaline can accomplish. How did my tiny teenage girl self hold back these two huge fully grown men? Completely insane. After that day, I realized just what I'm capable of when shit hits the fan, and also that if shit goes down, you're really on your own sometimes, and you need to have a plan, because chances are no one is getting there in time to actually help you. One of my favorite things to do was to go to my grandma's house in the fall of the year. This story takes place back in the 1980s or so, when I was around 13 years old. I lived in Virginia Beach, but my grandma at the time lived in rural Kentucky. So while I spent most of my time in the city, I enjoyed being out in the country whenever I could manage. I always had lots of fun climbing the hills and the trees that surrounded her house. We arrived late at night, so I couldn't go exploring for the first day that I was there. I was really eager to go out and do it the next day because of this. The adults always wanted us to be outside and away from them anyway. No one really cared that I and my cousin, who was also visiting, would go out and climb through the hills by ourselves. I had an uncle that was only a few years older than me. He used to try and scare us when we were younger and wanting to go exploring. He would tell us about all these vicious battles between American Indians and colonists in those hills. He made us believe that Indians were buried in shallow graves, and they would grab the feet of anyone who walked over their resting place and drag them to hell. That really terrified me when I was younger. The ground during this time was always covered in this huge blanket of leaves, so whenever we were out walking, I always half expected a hand to grab us from underneath. In fact, I even remember one time my brother, who was playing along with my uncle, once screamed that something had grabbed his foot and began screaming for help. While us younger kids had no interest in sticking around, we ran down the hill at the speed of light, screaming the entire way. The memories. Well, that was when I was a whole lot younger though. By the time this story happened, I didn't believe those sorts of things anymore. I had explored here, there, and everywhere on the hill since, and since nothing had happened to me, I knew it must just be a made-up story. My cousin Luke and I were the ones who went hill climbing on this day. We mostly had female cousins, and sometimes they would go climbing with us, but none of them wanted to come along this day. That was okay though. Luke and I didn't want to have to deal with watching the younger kids anyway. Plus, that meant we could explore deeper into the woods without them there. Soon we arrived to the top of the first hill, something we had done quite a lot. We climbed up a tree and looked around at the countryside. Most of the trees were without leaves at this time, so you could actually see pretty far out into the hills. Luke looked toward a certain direction and told me he thought we should go and see how far we could go that way. He felt like we would find something. It would surely lead us further into the hills than either of us had ever gone before. I agreed. We climbed down the tree and started down the hill. Once we got down, we immediately climbed over another hill. Halfway up, we decided to just walk along the side and see what we could find, as it was really tiring us out. I'm not sure how long we were out there. The woods could get really creepy in the fall. The sky was overcast that day, and the clouds were moving swiftly in the sky. Didn't seem to be much chance of rain, though. There was definitely a chill in the air, and it was enhanced every time the wind blew past. Eventually, we came upon a small creek. We decided to follow it, which is something we always did when we found a new water source. We likened it to a rainbow of exploration. If we followed the creek to its end, we would find a pot of gold, or at least something. Honestly, thinking back makes me feel pretty stupid, but hey, we were kids at the time. As we continued along, we saw a waterfall in the distance, so we decided to go check that out as well. As we got a bit closer though, we saw something extremely curious. There seemed to be a small, nondescript tent set up really close to the waterfall. Luke was really interested in this, and he wanted to go check it out. I told him I didn't think that was a good idea though. Someone was probably out camping, and they surely wouldn't like us disturbing them. He just couldn't be talked out of it though, and began walking in the direction of that tent. I followed him along the way, nervous about this, but not wanting to abandon him all to his lonesome. We arrived pretty close to the tent, but were still several meters away, when the flap to the tent just shot open. A grisly, dirty man with a matted beard and matted hair emerged from the tent. In his right hand was a huge machete, and he didn't look very happy to see us there. Luke stopped in his tracks. He slipped on the leaves and landed on his butt because he stopped so suddenly. I was scared. I thought the man was just going to kill him. The man was yelling some kind of gibberish at the both of us. We couldn't understand a single word he was saying, but I didn't really care. I could tell he was not meaning to welcome us. I meant to run and grab Luke, but fortunately he was able to get up to his feet on his own before the guy could get any closer. He ran towards me and grabbed me to run my butt off. I didn't need much convincing. The man coming after us would have already been terrifying, but it was even more so now that he had that machete on him. I turned and ran as fast as I could. The first time I looked back to see if the man was still chasing us, I could see him full-on sprinting towards us. I think that gave me a burst of speed to try and get away from him. I just kept running as hard as I could, avoiding trees and bushes, and hoping I wouldn't fall. It was a very long time before either of us dared to look back again. When we did, there was no sign of the scary old man nor his machete, but that didn't make us feel any more safe in these woods. We kept running until we got back to the hill that was right by my grandma's house. We told everyone what happened, and no one seemed surprised. We were told there were many people who lived out in the hills like that, and they told us the best thing you could ever do was to just leave those people alone. I was a latchkey kid growing up. Also, I was an only child, and both of my parents worked. My mom would always be home when it was time for me to go to school, but my dad would have already left for work in the morning. By the time I got home, both of them would still be at work. I would go into the house, lock all the doors, and then do my best to pretend I was not at home. I lived within town, so I didn't ride the bus to school. It was a decent walk there and back. Actually, my school had more children that walked than took the buses anyway. Because of this, there was generally a pretty big crowd of kids that gradually got sparser the further you walked along. Normally, about halfway through my walk back, I would be walking all on my lonesome. On this day, I was a little bit worried. When I'd walked to school, it was bright and sunny outside. However, 2/3 into the day, it started getting really dark outside suddenly. The wind picked up and was blowing hard through the trees. The clouds were black and green and moving swiftly through the sky. It was obvious that a thunderstorm was on its way. Still, it didn't start raining while I was at school. There was the occasional thunder and lightning though. I was really hoping it would just continue like this because I hadn't brought an umbrella or a raincoat to school that day, and I really hated getting rained on. After school, I began my long walk home. The wind was quite fierce, but that didn't really bother me. I could handle the wind. I just wanted to keep myself from getting completely soaked. I tried walking faster than I normally would, trying to arrive home as quickly as possible. About halfway there, though, this horrible siren began blaring in the air. I had heard this before, during tornado drills at school. We were taught that whenever you heard that siren, that meant a tornado was on its way. I was terrified. Getting wet was bad enough, but being caught out in the open in a tornado was even scarier. I was extremely frightened of tornadoes. I began running when I heard the siren. However, I was not in the best shape. I could only run so far before getting winded. Then I would try to run again after catching my breath. The siren began to blare through the whole town, and that was good enough motivation to keep going. I don't know what it was that caused me to turn my head in the moment, but at that exact moment I did, and as I did so, I saw the funnel touching down. I had never seen a real tornado in person before or since. If you haven't ever seen one, it fills you with a mix of awe and fear, and I felt both at the same time. The fear, though, was the biggest thing. I knew I had to get home right now. I tried my best to keep running. However, I kept looking to the side of me, fascinated by this tornado. As I ran, I kept wondering if it was moving toward me or not. I couldn't tell from the angle I was viewing it from. When I got home finally, I fumbled with my key to get the door open. Finally, I got it in and opened the door. Going in, I locked the door behind me. I knew I was supposed to head into the basement and do the duck and cover thing. That's what they taught us in the tornado drill back then at least. I was only in the house for a few moments when I noticed something a different kind of scary altogether. The back sliding glass door had been shattered. Now, I know everyone tells you that you should open your windows during a tornado or the pressure will shatter them, but it didn't look like it was the tornado that had done it in. I mean, why would the one glass door be shattered and every single other piece of glass was fine? I walked into the house and over to the basement stairs, only to find the light in the basement was already on. I was sure my mom would have turned it off already. I was about halfway down the stairs and looking when I saw someone down there in our basement. Our basement was like our family room, with plenty of expensive entertainment equipment there. The man was obviously a burglar and was currently stealing from us. I didn't know what to do. I was stuck between this burglar and a tornado rapidly approaching. I mean, how could anyone have a worse day than that? I decided the burglar was not nearly as bad as the finger of God though, and I ran down those stairs anyway. "Didn't you hear the tornado siren?" I yelled at the man. The burglar still hadn't noticed me, it seemed. He was shocked and moved toward me. "Take whatever you want," I told him. I ran to the corner and hid with my head beneath my hands. The burglar didn't get a chance to do much of anything though. The tornado was close now, sounding like a freight train running through my house. And then I heard the sound of it eating my house, and that's a sound I cannot explain. You would have to actually be in this situation to ever understand what that means, and I truly hope that never happens to you. The things around me began crumbling apart and falling. I felt things smacking against me. The tornado ripped apart my house, tearing it into pieces. I half expected to get sucked up into it, but luckily I was not. It ripped apart my house above me and threw the rubble all around the neighborhood. Fortunately, I didn't get buried underneath anything. In fact, there didn't seem to be any major damage to the basement. Pieces of the ceiling fell in, but most of it didn't. As I looked around, though, that burglar was no longer anywhere to be seen. I had to wait in the basement for rescue workers to come get me out of there. The stairs led to nowhere. Interestingly enough, the burglar had run upstairs just before the tornado hit the house. He got buried underneath all the rubble and suffered some life-changing injuries. Luckily, he didn't die, though. He did go to jail when I explained to the firemen and police as to what happened. As for me, I had a laceration and a couple of bruises on my back from things hitting me. But otherwise, I was all right in the end. I had a really scary experience when I was a little girl, around the age of 8 years old. This might be a little intense, so please be warned about that ahead of time. An aunt of mine had her house burned down, and very unfortunately, she also died in the fire. However, the firemen were able to save my 6-year-old cousin. Of course, she experienced something that would disturb her for the rest of her life. My aunt had been a single mother. She hadn't seen or heard from the father in years, so he wasn't able to take custody of his daughter. For a while, she came to live with us. My mom thought that if she was with a girl of her age, it would help her get better. It was really hard living with her and trying to get her to do anything. I used to love tea parties and would hold them often. I couldn't really get her to take part in them at all, though. She would just understandably sit there silently and look sad. She rarely talked, and the only time she once did was to say, "That cup is empty," as if she didn't know we were supposed to just be playing. The girl slept in the same room as me, as I had 2 twin beds in the room. It was fine, and for the most part, she seemed to sleep well. Occasionally, though, she would have very bad nightmares and would wake up in the middle of the night screaming. My mom would always come to the room and grab her, hug her tight, and try to make her feel better. I have to admit, I didn't like having her around. At only 8 years old, I guess I couldn't really appreciate what she was going through. I feel really bad about that now, especially since I've never had to lose my mom. But something about her creeped me out. She was always so quiet, only communicating with people mostly with nods and shakes of the head. She would occasionally walk into the room and look around at everyone without coming in, and sit down in place. Then, after a while, she would turn around and leave without a word. It was kind of creepy. One time, my mom took us for a walk. We lived in a second-story apartment. When we left the apartment, she stopped and looked at the window to it. I tried to get her to keep walking, but she didn't want to. My mom didn't notice at first, and didn't notice when I asked the girl what she was looking at. In a very rare moment of her actually talking, she told me, "Mommy is in the window." Of course, that chilled me, and I didn't want much to do with her. When my mom came over and told us to keep up, she went ahead and started walking alongside my mom. As I looked up at the window, though, I thought I saw a woman standing behind the sheer curtain. I felt my heart jump in my chest. I ran forward and grabbed my mother's hand. After that, I began to get a little bit scared of that house. I normally didn't, but that experience was enough to be pretty terrifying. The scariest thing, though, happened at night, and if I recall, it was about a week after what we saw in the window that day. My cousin and I were pretty soundly sleeping when I heard some sort of creaking noise that woke me up from my sleep. I looked over at my cousin's bed, only to notice that she was sitting up in it. She was rocking back and forth, and that was what was making the creaking sound. She was just doing it over and over again. I called out to her, trying to get her attention. However, she wouldn't respond to me in any way. She just kept rocking back and forth, staring at a certain area. I turned and looked to where she was looking at, only to realize that it was the bedroom closet door, and the door was wide open. We always kept the door closed when we were sleeping. I asked my cousin if she saw her mom in the closet again, remembering what she'd told me about last week. At first, she didn't respond, but when I asked her again, she turned and looked at me. "That's not my mommy in the closet," she told me. I looked back to the closet and saw the shadow of a person standing inside. I screamed for my mom at the top of my lungs. My mom rushed into the room and immediately turned on the lights. She saw that both of us girls were terrified and asked what was going on. I told her someone was hiding in our bedroom closet. My mom went in and searched, but somehow she didn't find anything. Both of us assured her that we'd really seen it, though. My mom took us both into her room and let us sleep with her that night. Although we didn't sleep great, it was the only way either of us could have gotten any sleep at all. My cousin stayed with us for about another 3 months. After that, a paternal aunt asked my mom if she could take custody of the young girl. My mom was okay with that, mostly because the aunt was very wealthy, and she thought she could provide a better life for her. I didn't see that cousin ever again. After she left, I didn't see any figures in the window either, or in that closet ever again. I went back to sleeping comfortably in my own room. I was around 12 years old when this happened. It was a Saturday morning, and my parents were going out of town for the weekend. They left my older brother to babysit, but as soon as they left pretty much, he did too. Yeah, great brother, I know. So I'm sitting there in the living room watching TV by myself when the doorbell suddenly rings. Instead of looking through the peephole like a normal person, I flung the door open, eager for company. I thought it would be my neighbor, not two middle-aged men I'd never seen before looking down at me. "Hi there, are your parents home?" I didn't even hesitate when I told them, "No, they're actually out of town for the weekend." Holy shit, if you could slap a child, I would go back and slap myself silly. They exchanged glances between each other when the older-looking man said, "Well, I'm your landlord. We need to come inside and check a few things out for a minute." And that's when I realized just how much trouble I was in. I knew my landlord personally. He was a friend of the family, and he was not either of the men standing before me. Thank God for some quick thinking, because I told them, "Yeah, alright, but I need to grab something first." Before they could reply, I slammed the door shut and deadbolted it. I ran to the kitchen, grabbed the phone, and dialed my mom's number. I remember crying, thinking, "Please pick up, please." When she did, the second I heard her voice, I broke down sobbing. "There's 2 guys at the front door and they want to come in. One of them said he's the landlord, but it's not Mario and I'm scared. Come home now." I heard pounding begin on the window. My mom must have heard it too, because next thing she said to me was, "Dad's on the phone with the police right now. You need to tell them that. Shout at the top of your lungs that the cops are on their way. They know you're home alone and they need to know you won't be for long. I'll be there soon." My parents were an hour away. How they made it home as fast as they did in 20 minutes, I'll never know. Through my tears, I yelled to the men as loud as I could that the cops were on their way. Hey, we weren't gonna hurt you. No need to cry. It's okay. We'll leave." Then there was silence. It seemed like a lifetime, but it was no less than 10 minutes later when the police arrived. I'll always remember the female officer who spoke with me that day. She calmed me down and applauded my quick thinking on shutting the door. She told me to never open the front door again unless it was someone I knew, and even then not to do so if I was home alone, which I wasn't for a very long time after. My parents pulled into the driveway like a bat out of hell, and my mom hugged me tighter than she ever had before. I was crying, she was crying. I got a big lecture on opening the door for strangers and how lucky I was to be alive. My brother got an even sterner scolding and got grounded as well. Not that he cared much. He moved out shortly after. The cops took a report and surveilled the area for the two men, but they never did find them. I learned my lesson that day. I have no idea who they were or what their true intentions were, but I don't care to ever find out. I have to start out by saying right away that I'm rather happily employed. I make decent money, and my family is very well taken care of. Unfortunately, however, that was not always the case. This story happened near the beginning of the Great Recession. I'm sure a lot of people can remember how bad things were at the time. I worked as a facilitator in a call center company. My entire job was training people about how to work on the phones. It was a 3-week course for each class, and once it was done, it started over with a brand new class. At some point, the company decided not to use full-time facilitators anymore. Apparently, they considered us a money drain or something. What they did instead was use call center workers in the summer and fall to do the training. They were paid less than we were and didn't get a bonus for doing the training either, so off we went. I had severance for a few months, but that was hardly a comfort. I had children, and I needed to find a job in order to take care of them. Everyone at the time was cutting employees, not hiring them, so I was not having any luck in finding a new job. When I was in the parking lot of a grocery store, a friend of mine came over to talk to me. She was one of those kind of annoying people who always trapped you in a conversation and wouldn't let you go. She was also kind of weird and into some shady things every now and then. I knew that she sold drugs on the side because she had offered me some in the past. Of course, I declined, and she'd since stopped talking about it. This time, though, she asked me if I had found a new job yet. I told her that I did not, and it was getting a bit difficult, as the severance money was quickly running out. I had no idea what I was going to do if I couldn't find a job before that and my savings were depleted. That was when she told me that she might be able to help me find a new job. I was somewhat dubious about this offer, considering her history, and insisted I did not want to do anything illegal. She reassured me, though, that it wasn't anything like that. She took out this piece of paper with a phone number on it and told me to call that number and mentioned that she was the one who had told me to call. Then, for the first time ever, she left the talk before I did. That was really quite strange for her, and I didn't know what to think about it. After a while, I decided it couldn't hurt to just try out the number, though, and see what exactly was going on here. I called, and someone picked up on the second ring. They gave me the name of the business, something I had never heard of before, and asked how they could help me. I gave them all the information my friend had given me, and they told me they could set up an interview the very next day. I was given an address, and they hung up the phone soon after. I was quite excited because everything seemed to be very legit, and I really had not expected it to be. I would be able to go to the interview immediately after I dropped the kids off at school. I didn't have a GPS or anything, so I had to find the place on my own. I drove, and when I was getting closer, I realized this was in a rather seedy part of town. In fact, it was an area with a lot of industrial buildings that had been closed down. Therefore, there was basically no traffic or cars or anything in the area. I kept checking the different addresses, trying to find the right one. Eventually, I did find it, because I recalled the name of the company. What stood out the most to me upon pulling up to this address was that there were no cars in the lot at all. I guessed to myself that maybe the employees parked in the back or something. I didn't give it too much thought, because the business could definitely still be running even with some other closed ones in the area. I got parked at what was marked as a spot for guests. Then I got out of the car. I walked up to the building, but as I did, I started to get very nervous. It didn't look like anyone was inside, and it was very scary walking up to it like this all alone. I walked up to the door and opened it. It was unlocked, and at first I breathed a sigh of relief. I was initially thinking I had been sent to a closed building. I went inside, and my relief quickly left me. There was no one at the reception desk. There were not any lights on, and the place was definitely deserted. I walked over to the elevator, pushing the button. Maybe the reception area was simply closed, but the place I was supposed to work at was further in and open. When I pressed the button, though, to my surprise, there was no power, and the elevator did nothing. I stood there for a moment, not exactly sure what I was going to do, and that's when I heard it. I heard a voice saying something in the distance. I couldn't totally make it out. It seemed to be coming from the staircase beside the elevators. I decided to go and open the door and try to hear what was being said. I opened the door and immediately wished that I had not. A loud voice was coming from below, chanting over and over, "It's for you, Lord. Come to me, Lord. It's for you." The voice was coming from down the stairs in the basement of the building. I was frozen for a moment and decided to close the door quietly. I didn't know what was going on in that basement, but it certainly had nothing to do with any job interviews. I intended to walk out of the building quietly, but my fear got the best of me. I sprinted out and got into my car. As I was driving out, I noticed several people now standing in front of the building, watching me leave. They weren't dressed like business people, though. They were all wearing these sort of robes or something. They just watched me as I left, and I sped away from this freaky as fuck sight. When I got home, I went to call my friend who had suggested that I go there in the first place. She didn't answer the phone, though. She didn't return my message, and I never spoke to her or saw her again. I have no idea what really happened that day, and I really hope that I never find out. I work out a lot. I've always been really obsessed with staying fit. I have also had training in wrestling and some martial arts. Although I don't particularly like the idea of fighting, I think I could do more than just hold my own in a fight. This is pretty important to know, because it makes my story that much scarier. Now, this happened in the fall, so of course the sun had been setting a whole lot earlier. I like to get out and jog right before the sun set, because it was nice to watch the fall sunset while I was exercising. So there I was, jogging, when I decided to cut through this park. It was a pretty big area, with a path running through the forest. When you came out of that wooded area, the path went by this big field with a children's playground right in the middle. When I was running past this playground, I stopped to get a brief look at the sunset. When I did, I noticed that there was a lone kid at the playground. They looked pretty young, and I thought it was weird they were out so late by themselves. I was just about to start jogging again when I noticed something else. There was a strange man standing just outside of the playground. He moved forward a bit and leaned against the swing set for a while. I don't know why I stood there and kept watching, but there was something about this guy that made me feel pretty uneasy. I wasn't sure if he had seen me yet or not, because his back was facing me the whole time. But he certainly hadn't been on the playground when I first showed up, so I doubted he was the parent of this lone child. The man walked up to the kid, and they looked like they were talking. I noticed the kid back off a little from the man, and the kid looked quite scared. I began to get quite concerned. I wasn't sure how I should tackle the situation yet. The kid stood up and began to back away from the man. I thought I should go up to them and see what was wrong. I began lightly jogging up to the playground. In a split second, however, the man grabbed the kid by the arm. The kid was doing his best to struggle and move away, but the man had a good grip on him. The kid began yelling, and I realized this person was either an abusive parent or a child abductor. I had to do something right now. I ran up to the guy and grabbed the arm that was grabbing the kid. I jerked his arm away. The kid got loose and fell to the ground. I twirled the guy around, so he was now facing me. I got a good look at his face. He was certainly a scary-looking man. He was thin and pale and looked like he hadn't been washed in quite some time. It was nasty looking, but the worst part were his eyes, which were totally crazed. The man, who was much smaller than me, turned his attention away from the child and jumped on me. He tried to knock me over. I was surprised because I was much bigger than him, but somehow he succeeded in taking me to the ground. The man was abnormally strong, and the fight was one of the hardest ones I've ever had in my life. He was screaming something about needing blood or something like that. After a struggle, I was able to subdue him by flipping him over onto his stomach and holding his arms behind his back with my left hand and knee. I tossed my cell phone over to the child and told him to call 911 right away. He didn't hesitate to do so. I held the still struggling man down until the police arrived. They took over from there and arrested him soon after. That's not the end of the story, though. I was there when the kid was talking to the cops, and the story he told them was quite scary. He told the police that the man had suddenly approached him, asking to play a game together. The kid was put off right away. He didn't want to play with this stranger, especially a stranger as freaky as this guy was. When the child backed off, the man grabbed him and started growling in his face, telling him that he kept seeing scary things. He told the kid he needed to drain all of his blood in order to make the visions go away. The guy was on some pretty serious drugs and was also mentally ill. I guess he suffered from schizophrenia or something, and the drugs made it worse. I heard he might have been on PCP or something. It was the first time I'd ever been around someone who was so high on drugs. It also explains how that little man was able to put up such a good fight with me. It chilled me to think about the fight after that, because who knows what would have happened if he had managed to win. Most fortunately, though, the kid was all right in the end. I checked up with him later, and he wasn't too mentally scarred about the whole thing, so that's the most important in the end, I guess. Now, I'm not 100% certain if these two events are correlated, but they certainly might be. I had an extremely messy breakup with a girl when I was in my 20s, which is quite a long time ago now. It was like something you might see out of a movie. We yelled, we screamed, we called names and threw things at each other. It ended with her and I mutually screaming as she left the house. I was at the door, screaming back as she walked to her car, and supposedly drove her way out of my life. I didn't hear from her for the rest of the week. In fact, I was quite relieved not to. I knew it would just lead to more drama in the end. I was hoping that everything would get back to normal, and I would never see her again. So it was on the weekend when I was home by myself that I had an experience that part of me thinks was instigated by her. I had gotten home pretty late on a Saturday night, after having been out at bars with some friends of mine. I wasn't ready to go to bed just yet, so I decided to keep having a few drinks in my home. Hey, I knew I was going to pay for it in the morning, but that was fine with me at the time. I had my television beside the window that faced out in my living room. That way I could just look over and see what was going on outside. Not that much was actually going on ever. but if it was, I would know about it right away. I guess you could also say I'm kind of paranoid, and if I'm watching TV and someone comes to the door, I want to be able to see who it is before they get there. Normally, I don't pay that much attention if I see someone just walking on the sidewalk in front of my house or something though. It's normal that kids and random people do that. This night, however, I did take notice of a particular person passing by. It was because this guy was very large and scary looking. He was also overly dressed for what the weather was like. What really got my attention though was that he kept glancing over at my house. I wasn't sure if he could see me or not, but I could sure see him. After the glances over to my house, he kept on walking on his way. I found that quite strange, but I soon put it out of my mind and went back to watching TV for a while. Feeling that I wanted another drink, I got up to go to the kitchen. There was a sliding glass door facing my backyard. I didn't normally pay much attention to my backyard, but when I turned out the lights this time, I don't know why, but I glanced over into the backyard out of instinct. At first, I couldn't quite make out what I was seeing, but I soon knew that it looked like someone or something was in my backyard. There was a shadowy figure. For a few moments, I thought it might be my eyes playing tricks on me in the dark. I walked up closer to the window to get a better look. When I tried my porch light, it wouldn't turn on because the bulb was out. I was looking and realized that there was indeed someone in my backyard. They were standing far enough back in the dark that I couldn't see them clearly, but it looked like a large man. My mind immediately went back to the man I had seen walking in front of my house earlier. He must have realized I'd seen him because he began moving quickly toward the door. The door fortunately was closed, but it was not locked. I had to move very quickly to flick the lock. Fortunately, I did so before the man grabbed the handle. At this point, I was able to get a good look at the man. He was huge, wearing a black jacket. His jacket opened as he moved, and I saw a large knife hidden inside. That scared the crap out of me. The man started tugging at the handle of the door. Although it was locked, he was mercilessly pulling on it. I was afraid he might easily break the lock and force himself through. I ran to the living room closet and grabbed something in there that I had to protect myself. I kept hearing him pulling on that door handle and eventually heard the lock break and the door open. He got into my house. I stood in the doorway of the closet as the man entered. When I saw him, he'd already pulled his knife out of his sheath. When he saw me though, he stopped in his tracks when he saw my gun pointing straight at him. "Get the fuck out of my house," I breathed. Suddenly, I was the one with more power, but I was still terrified. I didn't really know if I could shoot someone. I had never been in a situation to shoot anything other than a target. I just hoped the man wouldn't hear the fear in my voice. He took one step forward toward me, as if daring me to shoot at him. At that moment, it seemed like my body just took over, and I pulled the trigger. The man was hit in his left arm. He quickly recoiled and yelled in pain. However, he didn't keep still very long. He got up and ran out the back door of the house. I actually stood there for God knows how long, terrified about what just happened. I knew I needed to get up and call the police, but I was just frozen in place with that gun for a while. Finally, I did call. They looked around and I gave a description of the man. Interestingly enough, the guy was soon picked up when he was found lurking behind a convenience store. I actually had to go to the precinct, and there was a lineup. I was able to identify him quickly. The reason I brought my girlfriend up in the beginning was that she knew this guy. I suspected she had set this up, but that was never proven, and she was never arrested. The attacker did get a jail sentence for aggravated assault, so I guess there's some justice in that. We're going back almost 10 years ago now. One morning, I dropped my son off at school, then drove over to a nearby 7-Eleven with my infant daughter. It was pretty early in the morning, so there were only one or two other customers. One of them was an older-looking man with a walker who was slowly making his way around the store. I didn't pay too much attention to him. other than feeling kind of sorry for him. I picked up the few items I needed and headed out to my car. Right as I was putting my daughter in her car seat, I heard a voice call out from behind me. I turn and it's the old man with a walker, only there's something weirdly different about him now than when I saw him inside the store. He was walking straight upright, not leaning on the walker, and his voice sounded much younger than you would have expected from looking at him. I remember him saying, "Cute kid, huh?" Then, as I turned around, I only got the slightest look at the man in his brand new posture before he slammed the walker into the back of my legs. The force made my knees buckle, and I almost fell right on top of my young daughter. I'm not exactly the tallest woman in the world, so the height reduction from my knees buckling had me falling forward into my open car. I tried really hard not to crush her as I fell. I honestly thought he was trying to get me, which was bad enough, but when he grabbed me by the hair and started to drag me up and off my daughter, I realized he was trying to get her instead. I honestly didn't think I could get any more terrified, but the realization he was actually trying to take my infant daughter away from me was too much to bear. I remember letting out the loudest, most ear-splitting scream I've ever let out in my life, begging him not to take my baby. He was so much stronger and faster than he looked. I guess that was all part of his fiendish scheme, to have everyone let their guards down around him. It honestly seems like divine intervention now that I look back at it, but someone was just pulling into the small parking lot, just as he almost had a hand on my daughter. Seeing the struggle, they instinctively honked their horn over and over in a bid to break us up. I think they must have figured at first it was just an incident of spousal abuse or something, because they were only honking and didn't get out of their car. That was until I started screaming, "He's trying to take my baby!" The moment they heard that, they burst out of their driver's side door. The man sprinted past the passenger side and out towards the main highway. The second he did, another car came speeding by and stopped him. I first thought it might have been another person coming to tackle him or something, but instead the guy climbed into the second car and it sped off with a screech of its tires. What horrified me in the aftermath was that this was quite clearly a well-planned and almost perfectly executed attempt to kidnap my daughter. I wouldn't be surprised in the least if it had worked on a previous occasion. After the kind stranger calmed me down, they helped me call the cops, and I tried my best to calm my daughter down in turn. She was still too young to know what was really going on, but she'd picked up on my distress enough to be wailing and crying until I managed to lull her to sleep. The cops who arrived at the 7-Eleven a short while after said they'd never heard of such a thing happening there before, but they were able to check the cameras outside to try and get a clear image of the getaway car's license plate. I stuck around long enough to find out the car's plates came back as stolen. The cop I spoke to said there was a good chance they'd just ditched the vehicle somewhere after wiping it down for prints. If they'd already planned such a detailed operation here, there was a good chance they'd planned for it failing too. The only saving grace was that the officer assured me that my report was a step towards catching them. A small step, but a step nonetheless. The horrifying experience I went through that morning was not for nothing, as not only did the cops now have a description of the man who tried the kidnapping, but their failure to kidnap my daughter meant they'd probably think twice before trying the same plan on someone else. I took a lot of comfort in that idea. If it wasn't for the cop taking the time to reassure me of that, I don't think I'd have dealt with the trauma half as well as I did in the months that followed. I did a lot of praying too, of course. Desperate prayers that whoever had planned such a horrifying kidnapping would never ever be successful, and that no one else would have to endure the pure horror I did that day. I work at a bar in a suburb of Melbourne that is safe during the day but has become sort of notorious for a high rate of thefts and abductions during the nighttime, specifically along the main street that my work is on. I often work night shifts or late shifts even. Tonight, I even finished at 11 p.m. for some context. I'm an uppity 19-year-old girl. I got out of work at 11 p.m. and started to walk down the street. It's quite well lit in some parts, but extremely dark in others. I began looking to hail a taxi. I was having no luck in finding one though. In fact, there were very few cars about at this time, which was quite unusual actually. I looked across the road, only to see a man with a hoodie on that was concealing almost all of his face. From the parts that I could see, he looked somewhat young, maybe early to mid-20s, and seemed to be high on something. Quite a shady figure to me. I noted he was pretty tall as well. I guess I'd been looking at him for too long though, because he immediately crossed the street towards me, and I stopped looking at him. I started to walk faster, looking behind me to keep an eye on his distance, and now even more desperate to hop in a taxi. When I turned around to look at him once again, to my relief, he was walking down a side street. I stepped out onto the street to get a better view down the road when he came back around from that side street he'd just entered. My stomach dropped as I saw he now had 2 more people accompanying him. I started to walk really fast now, and they began to walk after me. I was going as fast as I could without jogging and was getting really panicked, thinking of hailing down just any car to ask someone for help. The 3 men were quickly gaining on me and were all screaming and shouting at me. My anxiety had started to sink in though, and I couldn't hear a word that they said. It was all only white noise basically. A taxi with its lights off drove past, and I ran out into the middle of the road. The driver stopped and said he was finished for the day and wasn't taking any more customers. I told him I was being followed and asked if I could sit in his car for a second just to feel safe. He let me into his taxi, drove 20 meters away, and told me to get out. The men were still there though. I begged him to take me out of sight at least a little further down the road. When he noticed how genuinely scared I was at that moment, I guess he got concerned and adopted a more fatherly tone. The taxi driver was actually extremely kind afterward and refused to let me get out of his car until he found me another taxi to get me home safely. He drove around with me for a few minutes until we found another empty one. He beeped the other cab down and explained the situation to him. I thanked both drivers profusely, and we swapped cars without incident. The next driver was also incredibly nice as well. He said he had a young daughter at home and got quite upset and angry, thinking about how people can take away your right to feel safe. I'm extremely thankful they were there to help me out that night. I don't know what would have happened if they weren't. This incident happened not all that long ago actually. I'm a 19-year-old female, and I obviously enjoy a night out with my friends. This particular night, a girlfriend and I had headed down to our local club/pub. We were dancing, drinking, and having a great time when I noticed it was around 2 a.m. or so. It was coming up on the closing time of 3 a.m. I noted we should probably think about heading out soon. If we waited until it actually closed, the wait for a taxi would be quite long, as everyone else would be looking for one as well. I let my friend in on my plans, and she insisted she wanted to stay. She then walked me out the front while I waited for a taxi. As we got to the top of the stairs, she saw me off at the door and headed back inside. I said goodbye to the bouncers, as I said it was a local place, and started walking over to the next taxi in the line. As I approached the taxi, I heard my friend call to me from behind. She still had my bank cards and money on her. Luckily, I walked back to the door to get them off of her, then said goodbye again. This time, as I turned to leave though, the bouncer stopped me. "Hey, you may want to take this second taxi in the line." Upon me questioning him, he didn't seem to have a reason behind this sudden advice and just insisted I trust him. I'm from Australia, and taxis usually wait in these lines. You have to take the next taxi as part of fairness. I explained to the bouncer that not only will taxi driver number 1 not be happy, but taxi number 2 may not even take my fare for this reason. Annoying, I know. Me being 19 and naive, I thought to myself, I only live around the corner. I have my phone as well. What's the worst that could happen, right? Well, obviously that was wrong. I took the first taxi in the line as I initially meant to. There were no immediate alarm bells. The man didn't seem any different than any other taxi driver. Not exactly polite, nor rude either. Just a normal guy. We were a few minutes into the fare, driving along the coastlines to my suburb, when all of a sudden, he pulled the taxi over to the side of the road and started walking around to my door. At this point, I was extremely confused as to what was going on. First, I thought maybe there was a flat tire or something, until he opened my door. I asked him what he was doing, and he replied to me, "We're going to the beach now." Alarm bells and red flags went off left, right, and center. I grabbed my phone and dialed 000 right away. I told him I was calling the police. I immediately saw him start to panic. He yelled at me not to be so silly and said he just wanted to spend some quality time with me. He reached for my arm and grabbed me to try to pull me out of the car. I pushed him away though, grabbed the door and slammed it closed. I waited to be connected. I've read quite a lot about people who are polite to creepers in these situations, but I was anything but at this point. I was soon connected with someone from emergency who asked me what my emergency was. I said I needed assistance right now and gave her the area where we were. She then proceeded to tell me I needed to call the police assistance line if it wasn't a true emergency. "Well, it's about to be if you don't get someone down here right now." She assured me a car was on the way and to get out of the car by myself. We were only a minute or two down the road from where we'd departed. Usually, there were at least 3 or 4 squad cars situated there, preparing for the end-of-night antics. Because of this, I knew I could have assistance in no time. While this was happening, the man was walking back to his driver's side, attempting to get back in. I don't know what he would have done if he'd gotten in with me in the car still, kicked me out or what, but I jumped out of the car as he got in, and he sped off without looking back. I kicked myself for not getting his taxi ID, which is something I'd usually do. I kicked myself even more for not just listening to the bouncer, who I see now obviously had a good reason for me to not get in this car. I rang my friend and asked her to stay on the phone with me. I told her I was still outside waiting for the taxi and had gotten bored. She offered to come and wait, but I insisted I was fine. Once the police came, they took me home and asked me what happened. They took a statement from me as well, but there wasn't much they could do, as I hadn't gotten any information on the taxi. The most I could provide was the driver's appearance and the company he worked for. I didn't tell anyone about the situation except for my then friend, who's now my boyfriend. He was shaken up by this. I hate thinking about what might have happened that night, and how lucky I am that it didn't. About 2 months on, my boyfriend, his housemate, and my sister arranged a cab to pick us up at my boyfriend's place and take us to the same venue this initially happened at. Guess which driver showed up? Yeah, that very same guy. I didn't say anything at the time to anyone because I knew it wouldn't have turned out well in the moment, but this time I made sure to get his ID and plate number and reported it to the police the very next day. Apparently, this wasn't even the first time he'd done something like this. It was the furthest he'd ever gotten, though. Most of the other complaints were similar. From what I know, the police made contact with the taxi company and informed them of the situation. I think he might have been let go after, but I'm not sure. I've definitely learned a lesson from this, though. I'm a 17-year-old from the UK, and this took place a few months ago at my grandfather's funeral, or at least the after-party for it. Me, my cousin, and her best friend were all drinking a bit, because that's what you do at a wake or whatever. I was 16 at the time it happened, and I needed to get home at 1 in the morning. I was completely shit-faced, so I called a taxi for myself. I wasn't going to be able to walk home in the state I was in. After 10 minutes, the taxi arrived. I quickly finished my drink, said goodbye to everyone there, and got in the taxi waiting outside. The taxi driver was a pretty ordinary-looking Pakistani or Indian-seeming guy. with dark hair and some thick glasses. I paid to go home, which cost something along the lines of 40 pounds, 50 maybe. I never said a word to him beside my destination. On the way, he asked a bunch of questions. My age, why I was out drinking so late, and why I was going home alone. I told him I was 18. I don't know why I did. Maybe I just wanted to feel older or not get in trouble or something. I said I was on the way back from a funeral and wanted to dull the pain. I didn't answer the last question he asked me though, if anyone was at home to open the door for me or see me to bed safely. At the time, I was just thinking the man was a good Samaritan, wanting to make sure I was safe. I just said that everyone at home was likely asleep, but it didn't really matter. I was often a rebel and came in late anyway, and they all knew that. In retrospect, I probably should have just said there was someone at home waiting for me to return. About halfway through the journey, the driver drove right past the turn he was meant to take. I pointed this out to him, and he just said his way was much quicker, and he didn't want to waste my time getting home. Wrong turn after wrong turn passed, and he used the same excuse every time. This way is much quicker, come on, don't worry about it. Then though, he turned down an alley near a closed down theater and a car dealership, which was also closed down. I told him he must be confused, because this was nowhere near my house. The car slowly came to a stop, and I became even more confused. I asked him what was wrong. He wrapped his arm around me and told me he couldn't focus on the road because of how distracting I was. He leaned into a kiss, but I blocked him with my hand and asked him what the hell he was doing. Keeping one hand on my shoulder, he grabbed my leg. This is when I started getting serious creeper vibes. He then unzipped his trousers and presented himself to me. I went from thinking he was just a regular guy who'd been receiving mixed signals or something to a full-blown rapist in seconds. He began to try and feel me up. I honestly had no idea what to do in this situation. Should I do what he wanted or try to escape? What if I didn't? He might try to kill me or something. I made a snap judgment and went along with it. I pretended everything was totally fine. I started to feel him up too. Luckily, before it could get anywhere else, he got a call. He told me he needed to answer it, and we had to do this some other time. I said okay, and he dropped me off at home. I haven't told anyone, and don't plan on doing so. I haven't called a single taxi since. I'm glad it didn't go anywhere further though, because if it did, I could have been killed or worse. Whoever was on the other side of that phone call, I really owed them my life. I called the police anonymously the next morning and gave them a description of the incident. No arrest has been made yet though. My husband and I were stopping over in New York before heading to our temporary home of Poland. We had been living there for about a year or so and are originally from Australia. We'd spent the past year traveling throughout some of the more shady parts of Europe, so we thought we were generally prepared for any weird incidents that might occur. We were tired as we walked through JFK, ignoring everyone who wanted us to take their special taxi or whatever. We went outside and waited in the line with all the other irritated travelers. When it was our turn, the taxi driver got out and left. Another guy came and took our bags. The motor was still running even. I didn't really think anything of it, and didn't really care at that point. When I insisted I take my own bag, and tried to open the trunk though, the man suddenly snapped at me. I was startled and said it was okay. I'd just sit with it on my lap instead. My husband and I traveled light, so we only had one suitcase between us. "Can you open the trunk?" my husband asked the guy. "Otherwise, there's going to be no room for us." The guy already looked pissed, and all we were asking was for him to do his job. I was already looking around for another cab, because I couldn't be bothered. "Fine," the guy snapped. He basically ripped the trunk open. I hadn't even gotten into the car yet. It was kind of a paranoid thing that I never got into the taxi alone, as a result of some kidnapping stories in Greece of a similar nature. I waited, and then I saw what was in the trunk as the man quickly tried to close it once more. It wasn't all over the flooring or anything, just on one side, but it instantly made me feel ill. I could see what looked a lot like blood. The spot was visibly wet, and I stared at it blankly. Even with the dim light, I could just about make out various other stains of similar darker colors. I had barely begun to process what I'd seen before he slipped my suitcase in and the trunk door was slammed. I was now wide awake and did not want to get in this taxi. Everything was wrong, and this was clearly a mistake. "Come on, what's the holdup? Get in!" the taxi stand dude urged us, as equally pissed off passengers behind us were waiting for their own rides. I tried to get my husband's attention, but he was already in the back seat. If this were a horror movie and I was watching, I would be screaming at the screen, "Don't get in that cab!" I got in the taxi anyway, with my bag on my lap. I clutched it as we spun around the corners, went forward sharply, and had brakes slamming constantly. I felt sick and couldn't stop thinking about what I'd just seen. Was that real? Halfway through my haze, though, I realized we were not going the right way. I mean, far be it for me to tell taxi drivers in their own city where the hell they're going. I like to be prepared, though, and I like to know where I am. If we're not taking the tourist scenic route where they charge you a lot of dough, this guy was clearly going the wrong way. "Hey, where are you going?" The words just fell out of my mouth. The man didn't say anything, though. He didn't flinch, didn't move, didn't even respond. "What?" My husband asked me if we were really going the wrong way. I shouted that we were. My husband, not one to take shit from anyone, then turned to the man. "Hey man, don't think you can screw with us. We're not paying more than we agreed upon, so stop fucking around and take us where we're going, or I'm gonna call the cops." He had no idea why I was freaking out, though. I didn't care about the extra money. I thought we were just a pawn in whatever this guy's master plan was. We were going to be swimming with the fishes in the Hudson or something. I was going crazy. My mind was wandering. Maybe that actually was blood in the trunk. This guy was going to kill us with his driving either way. Maybe some plans for later in some warehouse with all his serial killer friends or something. The driver immediately slammed on the brakes at a set of lights. "I'm pretty sure this is not a real taxi," I muttered to myself. The cab driver immediately spoke up. "Do you see the sign up there? It's a fucking taxi, you moron," he snapped. "Well then do your job," my husband snapped back at him without a second thought. Perhaps the guy thought this was too much trouble when loudmouth Ozzy Bogan and his crazy wife started snapping at him, because the driver suddenly turned around and we were going the right way to get to the hotel now. I made sure to check the trunk again when we got out, but it was much darker now, and I couldn't see anything clearly, except for a lot of shredded rags for some reason, with a deep rust color staining them all. So I recently had the unfortunate ability to recall something really scary my older sister and I saw on a walk home during elementary school. She confirmed what I remembered was true, and the more I think about it, the more it scares my now 36-year-old brain. My sister Bianca and I are 4 years apart. I had the blessing of being able to have the most attentive and protective big sister ever, and she always had this remarkable sixth sense about her. So I was 7 years old, first or second grade. My sister was in the 5th grade, age 11. We lived in a small town in the South Bay area of California, about 45 minutes south of San Jose. It was an extremely hot day, but we walked the usual 8 blocks from our elementary school to our home. Some info regarding our mother. She worked nights stalking at our local Safeway most of my adolescent life, so we were very independent children. Get up, get ready for school, go on our own. Mom slept until 3:30 p.m., then cleaned up, washed, and made dinner. Then she went out to work right away. That's just some background for the type of childhood I had at the time. Every day we stayed after school for an hour with our favorite kindergarten teacher, Miss Marthia. My siblings and I all had the blessing of having the same teacher that we developed a super close relationship with. We enjoyed helping her clean up and prepare for her morning class every day. Usually afterwards, Miss Marfia would drive us home, but she couldn't that afternoon. She had to stay later than usual to wait for her husband James to pick her up and take her to the mechanic to grab her car. This meant that my sister and I were going to be the only kids walking home at this time. We didn't care though, because we loved helping out our wonderful teacher, who was also our friend. In the 90s, the area behind our house was undeveloped. A lot a good 3 blocks long by 1.5 blocks wide, directly in front of the newly placed skate park. From our backyard gate, we could see that very same park. Upon passing by that park, we would always race and run from the sidewalk that bordered it to the back door of our fence. This was my favorite, because my sister always let me feel like I was a winner. Halfway through the run this time though, I was ahead, as usual, and I was passing through the normal sticker brushes. There was a lot of dirt and ugly tall weeds that would poke you badly if you got too close. Some of the bushes you could even hide under, they were so big. I'm literally only 100 yards from the fence when I hear my sister suddenly scream out my name. Not like a normal scream either. She shouted my first and middle name extremely sharply. I stopped dead in my tracks. I turned around and yelled backward, "What?" Before I could even fully turn around to see what was going on though, she pummeled into me. She was grabbing my shoulders while wrapping her arm to shield my face from what I'm sure I would be scared of in that moment. This was all while pushing me forward. I was so confused. There was no time to say anything. From the break between her fingers though, I swore I could see 2 sets of legs under a large bush. This is where my memory plays like I'm just watching a movie, and I can rewind every detail. I've spent many hours with my sister, recalling everything I'd blocked out. I was scared, but I could vividly recall it still. I witnessed an assault. They were lying down under a larger bush, with both sets of legs exposed. I saw a man dressed in a red tank top, with blue dirty jeans and black boots. He had sunglasses on, and he was very agitated looking. This was because he was choking a young woman. She was probably barely 20, wearing overalls, a white shirt, and white sandals. Her face was dirty, bruised, and her lips were blue, scratching at his hands and screaming. This is all I got to see, obviously more than enough for a child. My sister quickly grabbed me and yanked me an alternative way. I was so scared, asking her, "What was that? That guy was killing her." My sister simply said we had to hurry home and tell my mom. All I could see after is a blur until we got home and woke my mom up, hysterically telling her what we saw. She called the police, but we never got any information regarding the woman. I've scoured the internet for anything about an assault, kidnapping, anything in the area, but I've never seen or heard anything. My sister cried when I asked her recently about this memory, thinking it was something I'd just had a nightmare about once. The details I recalled, though, made her scared that it severely traumatized me enough to not remember. Who knows, though? It's scary in any context. I really hoped that that girl managed to get away, though, and the man that was attacking her reaped what he sowed eventually. I go to college on one side of the city, although I live on the complete opposite side. Because of this, I have to use public transportation quite often. Mostly, this means I use the subway system. It's great actually, because I'm able to get around easily, and I really have no desire to live in the area that my campus is in anyway. I never have problems on the subway, and despite the reputation that subway systems get, they really are generally safe. The only scary thing that's ever happened to me on the subway happened during my junior year of college. I had a really important paper that was due, so after classes I would go down to the library for some peace and quiet. Before I knew it though, it was already after midnight. I had to head on home to get some sleep. Now, this was not the first time I ever rode the subway that late at night. I wasn't really worried about anything happening. It was common for a homeless person to ride the subways at night often, as a place to sleep or settle down for a bit. More than anything else though, those kind of people were fairly obvious. They were always laying down and sleeping while I was sitting on the train though, and didn't seem to pose much a bother to anyone other than taking up some space. This time though, while I was sitting on the train, a man stepped through the far door from the other car. He was walking towards the end of the car that I was sitting at. He had a Bible in his hand and seemed to be reading some verse from it very loudly. I don't really know enough about the Bible though to know what exactly he was quoting, but it was something about being born again. I didn't really think too much of it. It wasn't that unusual to see someone preaching on the subway. What was unusual though was when the guy stepped through the door to go into the next car, I turned around to make sure he was gone. Only I saw he was just standing at the window of the door, giving me the most sinister look I'd ever seen in my life. When I looked back, rather than avert his gaze, he just stood there and kept on glaring daggers at me. I was the one to break eye contact with him first. I just went back to reading my book and tried to ignore that unpleasant feeling. I didn't look back around, but somehow I could still feel his eyes on me. When I finally got to my stop, I hurried off the train. Much to my chagrin though, he got out of the subway from a different car and immediately began following me. I tried to pretend that I didn't see this as I hurried to get out of the station. Once we were out though, he still kept following me, turning down every street I turned down. I had never been that scared before in my entire life. Fortunately though, I was able to get to my apartment building before he caught up with me. I opened the lobby door and hurried inside. I tried to close the door behind me quickly. However, before I could latch it, the man shoved his arm inside. I told the guy I knew he did not live there, and if he didn't leave me alone right now, I would call the cops. In what seemed like a very sincere voice, the man told me that all he wanted to do was make sure I had been saved. I responded that I was an atheist, and I just wanted to be left alone. "An atheist," he responded in a condescending voice. "You know you'll be going to hell when you die, right?" I told him I didn't believe in hell, and I wasn't scared of going somewhere that didn't exist. At that moment, the man reached into his jacket with his other hand and pulled out a blade. "I bet you're scared right now," he said to me. "I bet you're scared that I'm gonna send you straight to hell." He struggled with the door, trying to get it open, or at least get his hand with the knife through. He wasn't able to open it any further though. I wasn't able to completely fend him off either though, so we were kind of stuck in a dangerous stalemate. What the hell is going on here? I heard someone call out from behind me. For a moment I was startled, but one of my downstairs neighbors had come out into the lobby. He must have heard the commotion. "I've called the police, so if I was you, I'd get the hell out of here," he said to the homeless man. The homeless man stopped struggling, although he didn't immediately take his arm out of the door. After a moment, he thrust the blade back into his pocket and pulled his arm out of the doorway. He then took off running down the street. I thanked my neighbor, who revealed he actually hadn't had any time to call the cops at all. I didn't care though, as the bluff worked well. When I was a senior in college, I didn't have my own car. I really hated public transportation, but I got to ride free since I was a college student. Because of this, I often used it. Even so, crowded areas tend to really freak me out, so if I got out of class earlier in the day, I almost always waited until after rush hour to ride the bus home. I wasn't always able to do this, however. This one particular afternoon, I had to get home early. Honestly though, because of what happened at the bus stop, I can't even really remember what I had to get home early for. I was waiting for the bus, but when it pulled up, it was so crowded there was no way I could have gotten into it and been comfortable at all. A few others tried to squeeze their way on, but the majority of us at the stop didn't want to do that. It was rush hour, and there would be another bus coming by soon, certainly. If you ride public buses, you probably know that the bus isn't supposed to be in motion if anyone was standing in front of a line at the front. Well, there were several people packed into this area. The driver wasn't closing the doors. he demanded that some people get off the bus so he could finally take off and leave. It wasn't happening though. Nobody wanted to get off. I was worried about this because I saw the second bus was coming up soon. It may have appeared to the driver of the second bus that we were all still boarding, so we only stopped for a moment. Almost immediately, the second bus driver started back up and moved to go around the first bus. The lady beside me got tired of waiting, I guess. I assumed she went to walk to the subway station instead, so she started walking across the street in front of the bus stop. The very moment she stepped past that parked bus, though, the woman was hit by the second bus that was just passing the first. It was such a shocking moment. I could literally feel the woman's blood splattering all over me. The shock of what I was seeing and what I was feeling was overwhelming. I feel bad even saying that though, because I wasn't the person who got hit. No matter how scary it was for me, it must have been 1,000,000 times worse for her. The hit knocked the woman forward, and I watched in what seemed like slow motion as she slammed on the ground, then rolled over and over on the asphalt. I can't even describe how horrible it looked. I figure you probably don't want that description either. I immediately ran over to her to check if she was still alive. Despite how horrific she looked, thankfully she was. The bus driver stopped and got out pretty quickly. I was pushed behind a bunch of people who started tending to her. Fortunately for the woman, the bus had not been going at full speed, so she did survive the hit. For the longest time though, I always imagined her blood splattering over me every time I saw a bus coming down the road. It was a horrifying experience. I was taking the train home after a long day at work. Usually the trains are pretty crowded. I work a late second shift, however, so it was often nearly empty by the time I was going home. When I got on the train at my stop this day, I was able to find a car that was completely empty. I was grateful because I'd have a place to sit down and read until my stop in peace. A stop or two later, though, another man climbed on board the train in my car. He went to the far side and sat down. Although I was happy he was sitting further away from me, I wasn't too happy that he sat down in a seat directly facing me. I became even less happy when I noticed he was just blatantly staring at me. As the train went on from start to finish, my ride home took approximately an hour or so. I was not looking forward to just sitting there with this weirdo looking at me the whole time. If you've ever been in a situation like this, you would know exactly how that feels. I didn't want to get up and move though, because I was afraid he would just get up and follow me. That would confirm that he was a creep. I tried to just read my book for a while, but it was really hard to concentrate with how intensely he was staring at me. I eventually looked up from my book when I saw that the guy had been moving around for a bit apparently. I looked up just in time to see him pull a rubber mask over his face. When he put his hands down, I noticed it was a leather face mask. You know, like the killer from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I was startled, but I tried not to let it show. I just looked back down at my book and tried to ignore him. I could see the guy if I only looked up a bit, so as long as I could take notice of him out of the corner of my eye, I would know if he was trying to do anything else. I told myself he was probably just some jackass trying to creep people out on the train, wanted to give me a little scare. I can't explain how creepy it was though, that he just sat there in silence for the rest of the ride, just looking at me through the eye holes of the rubber mask. Each time I raised my eyes just a little, I would confirm that he was still staring at me. My stop just couldn't come quickly enough. When it was getting closer finally, I got out of my chair and hurried over to the exit. While I was standing there, as the train slowed down, I saw the guy get up and begin walking in my direction, still wearing that mask. I groaned, realizing he had more than enough time to get to the door and get off at my same stop. He was slowly walking toward the door, not in any great hurry it seemed. I just knew he was going to get off the train with me and try to follow me after. Do who knows what after that. I mean, maybe he was still just a jerk trying to scare me, but maybe he was a jerk who wanted to do more than just a scare. As the stop came, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. When I looked back into the car, I saw a conductor walking up to the man from behind. As the train came to a stop, the masked man turned around and took a swing at the conductor. As he did so, I saw two other conductors rush into the car behind them. The train stopped and the doors shot open. I hurried off the train as quickly as I could. I was just one guy. I was sure these three conductors could handle the creep. I made sure he was not trying to follow me off and got away from that train station as quickly as I could. I have no idea what happened after. My wife and I have one daughter together. I'm a professional writer, so I work from home. My wife is a project manager though, so she's gone throughout the day. This is pretty important to know for the dynamics of this story. This story happened on a bright spring day. My wife was already at work, and I wanted to get some lawn work done before I had to go to work myself. My daughter hated the noise of the lawnmower, so I put some cartoons on the TV for her while I went out to mow the lawn. There are only two doors to the house. One is in the front where I began mowing. The other entrance is in the back of the house from the kitchen. We never use that back door, except to sometimes take the garbage out. Usually it was kept chained and locked. Our living room had a huge picture window in it, so I was able to see inside to check on my daughter while I was pushing the lawnmower around. It got hot pretty quickly outside, and we all know that pushing a lawnmower in the hot sun can really take its toll on you. We had a decently big lawn as well, so I was starting to get a bit tired and thirsty. I thought I would take a break from mowing and turned it off. I then glanced over at the picture window to check on my daughter. Needless to say, I was shocked when I saw a huge man now standing in the window, looking right at me. He grabbed the drapes and pulled them closed. I was terrified for my daughter's safety. I immediately sprinted towards the house. I assumed whoever the guy was, he must have locked me out of the house already. The front door opened immediately, although the drapes on it were closed. When I got inside, the living room was empty. Neither my daughter nor the guy I saw were in there. I assumed they must have run out the back door. I sprinted into the kitchen, only to find the kitchen door was chained and locked as usual. Perplexed, I paused for a moment. I couldn't figure out for the life of me. Then I felt something touch my hand. I jumped up. It was my daughter. She asked me if I was done mowing the lawn already. I asked her in a panic where the man who had closed the drapes was. She was pretty confused and said she hadn't seen any man. She had in fact just gotten up to go to the bathroom a few minutes ago. Luckily, my daughter was okay and seemed to have missed the man. I called the police, who searched my house. They found nothing wrong with the back door, the chain, or the lock. The only way the man could have gotten both into and out of the house was through the front door. The police assumed he must have hidden from me while I was mowing the lawn, then snuck in while I wasn't looking. Then, when I went inside, he must have hidden from me and went out the front door while I burst into the kitchen in a panic. Now, I guess that's possible, but I'm not sure how to answer the question of how he got inside when I was in the front yard the entire time. Certainly a mystery to be sure. I'm a really clean person. Although I take a shower every day and occasionally even twice a day, I really can't stand being wet. The absolute only way I can deal with the unpleasant feeling of being insulted with water is by keeping the water as hot as possible. I live alone in a really old house with a really old water heater. Because of this, the hot water doesn't always last as long as I'd like it to. The most disturbing thing that's ever happened to me happened a few years ago during a week in the winter. I was at work and we got hit by a snowstorm. Before leaving work, I had to shovel over a foot of snow off of, out from under, and from in front of my car. I was pretty sweaty because of this, an extremely gross feeling by that point. I was just dying to take a shower when I got home. I went over to the shower, and my hot water only lasted for a few moments. It was a pain in the ass, because when I felt it getting cold, I knew I had to wash up as quickly as possible and get out of there. The water was just way too cold. It wasn't completely unusual for this to happen sometimes, so I really didn't think that much about it. It was just an unlucky day for me. Unfortunately for me, the unluckiness continued throughout the week. The snow just kept coming and coming, and every day when I got home, I had to take a shower. My hot water would only last for a couple of minutes at most. I had to face the fact that the heater was probably getting too old to function properly, and I might have to replace it soon. I'm slightly handy myself, so I looked up some website information on water heaters. I decided to check the heater out myself on the weekend. I have one of those basements that's more like a cellar. It's only accessible from the outside, and the walls are all cinder blocks. The crawl space for the house is not completely blocked off either. After finding all the information I needed, I grabbed up some tools and went down to the basement. I really hated the lighting down there because it was only one single light bulb hanging down from the ceiling with a chain to turn it on. I had to walk down the stairs in the dark and fumble my way over to that single light. I pulled the chain to turn it on, and I screamed the moment the light turned on. I was looking directly at a man lying in the crawl space, staring at me. Terrified as anyone would have been, I ran back up the stairs as quickly as possible. I locked the door from the outside and headed to the house to call the police. It turned out the man had been living in my crawl space all winter. He had food and blankets and all sorts of things down there. I shuddered to think how much longer he would have been down there without me even knowing, had my water heater not spontaneously stopped working. I'm a bit up there in years, and I don't have any children of my own, so I don't know if this is still something parents do. If they do, I think they should be shot. My parents were not great parents, and whenever they didn't have the patience to deal with me, they would always scare me. They told me if I didn't behave or do my chores or basically anything that even slightly annoyed them, like going to bed on time, that the boogeyman would sneak into my bedroom while I was sleeping and drag me off to hell. Of course, when you're that young, it's easy to believe those sorts of things. That just makes it all the more terrifying. Whenever my parents brought up the boogeyman, I just knew I couldn't risk it. I quieted down a lot. That was probably my biggest mistake, because it just made them more likely to continue this in the future. Around the time I was 10 years old, I'd begun to hear noises coming from my closet at night. The first time it happened, I ran and told my parents that the boogeyman was in my closet. All they did was tell me I needed to go back to bed, where he would come out of the closet and drag me to hell that very night. I went back to bed, although it was a long time before I actually went to sleep. The following night, I heard the noises again. This time, I was determined not to go running to my parents. I really was convinced the boogeyman was in my closet, and I didn't want him to drag me to hell. When I heard a loud noise in the closet of things falling down, though, I left my bed and dashed towards my parents' room. The end result was the same as it had been the night before, so I stopped going to tell my parents about the noises, even though I heard them every single night. Each night I couldn't sleep until the noises stopped. Since I wasn't bothering my parents anymore, they just thought I was being well behaved. They allowed me to have a sleepover, and I invited my best friend, Brent. I told him what had been going on. He thought it was all in my head, but he was willing to stay up and listen for me. Sure enough, that night, Brendan was in his sleeping bag when we both began hearing noises again. Brent nearly peed himself as we both ran out of the room. He confirmed to my parents that something really was going on in there. My dad finally decided to check it out. When he came to the room, he heard the noises in the closet too, only they weren't really coming from the closet. When he opened the door, nothing was there. The noises had been coming from the closet ceiling, which was right under our attic. For all his faults, my dad was a pretty tough guy who didn't mess around. He was also a hunter. He went and grabbed his shotgun rather than calling the police. He said it might just be an animal, and he wanted to be sure first. He made Brent and I go wait with my mom. While we waited downstairs in the living room, we heard one shot go off from the shotgun. This time, even my mom was afraid. After a few moments, we heard noises on the steps of the house coming down from the attic, then from the second floor. We froze, completely scared of what might be coming down the stairs. We saw first a man we had never seen before. It frightened us for sure. Then we saw, though, that his hands were tied up, and my dad was right behind him with the barrel of the shotgun at his back. He held him there while my mom called the cops. It turned out that this man had broken into our attic a month before and was living there. The shot we heard was my dad firing a warning shot. It also blew a hole in the ceiling that he had to fix up later. I often wonder, though, if my parents had never used this boogeyman nonsense to scare me, how much sooner would they have caught this guy?